My own son stood in a courtroom, placed his hand on a Bible, and swore under oath that he saw me push his pregnant wife down a flight of stairs. I went to a maximum security prison for 2 years, for a crime I never committed, watching helplessly from a cold cell as they seized the $60 million empire I spent my entire life building. Every single month they came to the prison visitor center smiling for the guards, pretending to be the perfect, forgiving family. Every single month, I refused to walk out of my cell to see them. They assumed I was broken. They assumed I was hiding in shame. But today, the heavy steel gates finally opened, and the day of my release is the exact day their perfect stolen lives come crashing down. The metallic screech of the Illinois State Penitentiary gates sliding open was a sound I had dreamed about for 730 agonizing nights. I stepped out into the crisp, biting wind of a Tuesday morning. I am Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and for the last 2 years I have been nothing more than inmate number 84299. I stopped for a brief moment, taking in my first breath of unfiltered free air. I adjusted the collar of the cheap, ill-fitting gray suit the state provided me upon my release. The harsh fabric scratched against my skin, serving as a stark, humiliating contrast to the tailored Italian wool suits I used to wear when I ran my company. Across the wide gravel parking lot, a pristine midnight blue Mercedes SUV was idling. Standing right beside it, looking like they had just stepped out of a luxury lifestyle magazine, were my son Bradley and his wife Monica. Bradley, 34 years old, wore a designer cashmere coat that caught the morning light perfectly. Monica, 31, clutched a designer handbag that probably cost more than my first car. They had even brought a freelance photographer with them. The man was hovering a few yards away, snapping pictures to document this beautiful, heartwarming moment of family reconciliation for their wealthy social circle back home. I looked at them, and my stomach churned with a rage so deep, so cold, that it frightened even me. I had built a $60 million supply chain logistics firm from absolutely nothing. I worked 80-hour weeks, missing holidays, missing family dinners, sweating and bleeding to build an empire so my son would never know the bitter sting of poverty. I gave them everything a father could possibly give. And how did they repay me? By orchestrating the most vicious, calculated lie imaginable, tossing me into a concrete cage and stealing the very company I built with my bare hands. If you are listening to this story right now, I need you to pause for a second. If you have ever been betrayed by the very people you sacrificed everything for, hit the like button to show this old man some support. Please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of my story, and tell me in the comments down below, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? It truly warms my heart to know where my words are reaching. As I began walking across the crushed gravel, the rocks crunching loudly beneath my stiff shoes, Bradley stepped forward. He stretched his arms out wide, arranging his face into a mask of pure manufactured relief. "Dad," he called out, his voice thick with fake theatrical emotion. "Dad, you are finally home. We are so glad this nightmare is over. We are ready to put the past behind us." Monica stepped up right beside him, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk tissue. "We forgive you, Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We just want our family back together. We brought the car to take you straight to the estate. We have a wonderful welcome home dinner prepared just for you." I did not break my stride. I did not slow down. I walked straight toward them, my eyes fixed dead ahead, my expression entirely unreadable. Bradley reached out to hug me, ready for his photo opportunity, but I stepped right past his outstretched arms, completely ignoring his existence. The freelance photographer lowered his camera, looking incredibly confused. Just a few yards behind their gleaming Mercedes, a black, unassuming SUV was parked with the engine running. Standing by the driver door was Mitchell Pierce, my fiercely loyal attorney, the only man who had stood by me when the rest of the world called me a monster. Mitchell gave me a brief, sharp nod of respect and opened the back door for me. I climbed into the leather seat. Bradley spun around, his fake smile faltering, sheer panic briefly flashing in his eyes. "Dad, what are you doing?" he asked, dropping the loving son act for just a second. "We came all this way to pick you up. The press is going to see this. You cannot just walk away from us." I reached out and pulled the heavy car door toward me, but before pulling it entirely shut, I paused. I rolled the tinted window all the way down. I looked right past my son, locking my eyes directly onto Monica, the cold, calculating woman who had orchestrated my ruin. She stared back at me, her jaw tightly clenched, suddenly realizing that her helpless, defeated father-in-law had died in that prison cell. "Enjoy your last day of freedom, Monica," I said, my voice low, steady, and completely devoid of mercy, "because tomorrow you will be wearing the exact same cheap gray outfit I am wearing today." I rolled the window up completely, cutting off the sound of Bradley sputtering in confusion. "Drive Mitchell," I said, leaning my head back against the leather headrest. As the black SUV pulled away from the prison, leaving my son and his treacherous wife standing frozen in the dust, I closed my eyes. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken me. They had absolutely no idea that for the last 2 years I had not been mourning my lost life. I had been meticulously planning my revenge. 3 years ago, the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton in downtown Chicago was transformed into a breathtaking spectacle of white imported orchids and cascading crystal lighting. The total bill for this single evening was a staggering $150,000, a sum I transferred from my personal accounts without a second thought. Bradley and Monica wanted a royal wedding, and I wanted my son to be happy. More importantly, that I wanted the evening to be perfect for my wife, Patricia. Confined to a wheelchair due to rapidly advancing neuropathy, she had endured grueling physical therapy for 3 straight months just to build the stamina to attend. Her spine required a custom-made violet silk cushion specifically engineered by her medical team to relieve pressure on her failing nervous system. It was her only defense against agonizing pain. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the ceremony concluded flawlessly. The 300 guests transitioned into the lavishly decorated foyer for the cocktail hour. Patricia was resting safely near the string quartet, sipping sparkling water and smiling at old friends. She wore a stunning silver chiffon gown, her first new dress in over a year. I squeezed her fragile hand, promising I would return in 5 minutes. I needed to check on the bridal suite to ensure the event coordinator was keeping the schedule. Bradley was supposedly downstairs, greeting his college fraternity brothers, leaving the bride and her entourage completely unsupervised. The heavy oak door of the gold room was slightly ajar when I approached. The sharp scent of expensive hairspray and spilled champagne wafted into the quiet corridor. Then I heard it. Monica's unmistakable high-pitched cackle echoed off the walls. I stopped my Italian leather shoes, making no sound on the thick carpet. Hidden entirely by the shadows of the hallway alcove, I peered through the narrow gap in the doorway. Inside, Monica stood in the center of the room, wearing her $12,000 custom-fitted lace gown. She was not touching up her makeup or practicing her vows. Instead, she was holding Patricia's distinctive violet silk cushion. In her right hand, she gripped a large commercial-grade tube of cyanoacrylate adhesive. It was not standard craft glue. It was heavy-duty industrial sealant used in construction. I watched my blood turning to ice as my daughter-in-law methodically squeezed thick, clear lines of the chemical adhesive deep into the woven silk fabric. She dragged the nozzle back and forth, ensuring the glue soaked into the material, where it blended perfectly with the dark violet threading. "She just had to roll down the aisle looking so frail and tragic," Monica sneered angrily, adjusting her diamond tiara. Half the guests were crying over her instead of looking at me. This is my day. Well, let us see how much sympathy she gets when she tries to stand up for the family portrait and rips her entire dress off. Her sister Harper giggled from the velvet sofa, taking a long sip from a flute of expensive champagne. "Are you sure that stuff will actually hold?" Monica tossed the empty plastic tube into a nearby wastebasket with a victorious smirk. "It cures in 10 minutes. when Bradley and the groomsmen lift her out of that chair for the photos on the main stage. The back of that hideous silver dress is going to tear right down to her undergarments. She will be completely exposed in front of everyone. Sloane, a bridesmaid lingering by the vanity mirror, expressed a flicker of mild concern. What if Bradley gets mad? He might freak out if his mom gets hurt. Monica waved a manicured hand, dismissively scoffing at the mere thought of my son possessing a spine. Bradley will believe whatever I tell him. I will simply say the hospital staff must have spilled medical tape or some kind of resin on it before they left the house. He is so desperate to keep me happy tonight, he will not even question it. My knuckles turned stark white against the brass door handle. My chest tightened until it became difficult to pull oxygen into my lungs. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. This was not a fleeting moment of bridal stress. This was a calculated predatory attack on a defenseless, dying woman. Patricia had spent weeks mentally preparing for this event, fighting through chronic agony, all to celebrate the woman who was currently plotting her ultimate humiliation. I observed Monica meticulously placing the poisoned cushion into a decorative tote bag. She commanded Harper to take it down to the main ballroom immediately and place it on the reserved wheelchair spot at the head table. The orchestration was flawless, indicating a terrifying level of psychopathy I had never noticed before. The financial irony hit me like a sledgehammer. I had paid $15,000 just for the open bar these women were currently drinking from. I wrote the check for the very lace dress Monica was wearing. I funded the entire stage for this twisted theatrical performance. And my reward was the premeditated public humiliation of my ailing wife. Harper left the room with the tote bag, heading directly toward the service elevator. I flattened myself against the alcove wall, completely hidden by a marble pillar. I let her pass without making a sound. I did not confront Monica in the suite. An explosive confrontation right now would only allow her to play the weeping victim, twist the narrative, and ruin the evening for Patricia. I checked my platinum watch. The timeline was incredibly tight. The grand entrance of the bridal party was scheduled in exactly 25 minutes. After that came the speeches, and then the mandatory family portraits on the main stage. I had less than half an hour to intercept that deadly cushion before Patricia was seated for the remainder of the evening. Pulling out my phone, I texted my private driver instructing him to bring Patricia's backup cushion from the trunk of our SUV immediately. Then I began my rapid descent down the grand staircase toward the main ballroom, my mind rapidly shifting from sheer shock to a cold, razor-sharp focus. I entered the ballroom through the side doors. The 300 guests were completely oblivious, laughing and clinking glasses in the foyer. The room was a vast sea of crystal chandeliers and imported floral arrangements. I spotted Harper near the head table. I watched her discreetly slide the glued violet cushion onto the steel frame of Patricia's wheelchair, perfectly positioning it for maximum contact. Harper quickly retreated to join the rest of the bridal party lining up in the lobby. The trap was officially set. The industrial glue was quietly curing into a hardened, invisible weapon. I walked purposefully toward the head table, the plan forming in my mind with lethal, unforgiving precision. The gears of retribution had just begun to turn. The head table was draped in white silk and adorned with towering arrangements of imported white roses. I reached the wheelchair belonging to Patricia, which had been parked temporarily at the far end of the dais by the catering staff. My hands moved with a swift mechanical efficiency, betraying none of the absolute fury burning in my chest. I lifted the contaminated violet cushion, the industrial adhesive already tacky against my fingertips. Moving down the length of the long table, I located the center seat, designated for the bride. The venue had provided an ornate, high-backed velvet chair for her, covered in a decorative white satin slipcover. I carefully slipped the violet cushion directly beneath the folds of the satin slipcover, ensuring the glued surface faced upward. I smoothed out the fabric, making the deadly trap completely invisible to the naked eye. My driver, Thomas, appeared discreetly through the side entrance a moment later, handing me the clean, identical backup cushion, which I immediately placed on the wheelchair. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung open, and the master of ceremonies announced the arrival of the wedding party. A thunderous applause erupted from the 300 guests as the groomsmen and bridesmaids danced their way into the room. Bradley and Monica entered last, bathed in the glow of a dozen professional spotlights. My son beamed with a naive, blinding pride, completely oblivious to the venomous nature of the woman clutching his arm. Monica waved to the crowd like royalty, her $12,000 lace gown trailing heavily across the polished hardwood floor. She practically dragged Bradley toward the head table, eager to claim her throne. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, my expression locked into a polite, fatherly smile. My heart pounded a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs as I watched her approach the rigged velvet chair. Monica gracefully lowered herself into the center seat, the heavy layers of her imported dress settling directly over the hidden violet cushion. The satin slipcover provided a brief buffer, but the sheer weight of her body immediately pressed the delicate lace fabric into the curing industrial adhesive. I watched her shift her weight twice to get comfortable, unknowingly grinding the chemicals deeper into the intricate threading of her skirt. The catering staff immediately approached, pouring premium champagne into her crystal flute. She threw her head back and laughed at a joke Bradley made, thoroughly enjoying her perceived victory. From my vantage point, I could see the exact moment the adhesive began to bond with the dress fabric. A faint, unnatural stiffness developed at the base of her gown, locking the material to the chair underneath. The trap was sprung, and there was absolutely no turning back. The first course, a lobster bisque, was served to the guests with synchronized precision. I walked over to the lobby doors to escort Patricia into the room, gently gripping the handles of her wheelchair. She looked beautiful, completely unaware of the malicious plot that had almost ruined her evening. I carefully wheeled her to her designated spot at the end of the head table, helping her settle onto the clean, safe backup cushion. She let out a soft sigh of relief, thanking me for ensuring her comfort. I poured her a glass of sparkling water and kissed her forehead. Across the long table, Monica caught my eye. She smirked clearly, assuming that my wife was sitting on the ruined cushion. I raised my glass to her in a silent, mocking toast. She happily raised her champagne flute in return, wholly unaware that she was celebrating her own imminent destruction. The best man took the stage to deliver his speech, capturing the attention of the entire room. Monica turned her body to face the podium, crossing her legs under the table. The sudden movement caused a muted tearing sound to echo slightly from beneath her chair. She frowned, her hands dropping to her sides to investigate the strange noise. I watched her fingers brush against the satin slipcover, feeling the stiff, hardened patch where the glue had fully cured. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, but she quickly masked it, unwilling to draw attention away from the speech. The chemical reaction of the cyanoacrylate was generating a faint heat, warming the base of her spine. She shifted uncomfortably again, trying to pull her dress forward, but the lace refused to yield. The heavy gown was now permanently fused to the seating structure. During the toast, Monica leaned over and aggressively whispered something into the ear of Bradley. My son glanced down at her chair, his brow furrowing in confusion. He reached a hand behind her waist, attempting to pull the fabric loose, but his efforts were completely futile. The industrial adhesive had bonded the lace, the satin slipcover, and the hidden violet cushion into a single immovable block. Her face began to flush with a deep, mottled red. Her frantic, jerky movements were causing the top layers of her dress to stretch and pull painfully tight against her shoulders. She hissed a command at her sister Harper, who was sitting 2 seats away. Harper dropped her fork and ducked under the table, supposedly to retrieve a dropped napkin, but actually to assess the damage. Harper emerged seconds later, her face pale and her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. The elegant dinner service concluded smoothly, and the jazz band struck up a lively tempo to signal the dancing portion of the evening. The event coordinator marched up to the head table, gesturing for the couple to hurry toward the dance floor for the traditional ceremonial cake cutting. Bradley stood up eagerly, offering his hand to his new wife. Monica absolutely did not move. She remained rigidly glued to her seat, gripping the edge of the table with white, trembling knuckles. The spotlight swung around, illuminating her terrified face in a harsh glare. The ticking time bomb had finally reached its absolute zero. The DJ's voice boomed through the high-end sound system, commanding the attention of every guest. He eagerly invited the newlyweds to the center of the dance floor for the traditional cake-cutting ceremony. A 5-tier vanilla confection, decorated with gold leaf and edible pearls, was being rolled out by the catering staff. Bradley immediately jumped to his feet, a wide, oblivious grin plastered across his face as he extended his hand toward his new bride. Monica grabbed his hand, her diamond ring catching the spotlight, and pushed her weight onto her heels to stand. The sound that followed was deafening in the suddenly quiet room. It was a violent, guttural rip of thick fabric giving way under immense tension. Monica let out a sharp, breathless shriek as the forward momentum of her body fought against the immovable force behind her. The industrial adhesive had cured into a rock-solid resin, bonding the intricate French lace, the satin slipcover, and the heavy violet cushion into a single impenetrable mass. As she lurched upward, the entire back panel of her $12,000 gown simply tore away from the bodice. The force of the tear sent frayed threads and loose beads clattering onto the polished hardwood floor. Monica stumbled forward, her hands instinctively flying backward to cover the massive gaping hole in her dress. The delicate silk undergarments she wore were now completely exposed to the harsh glare of the professional lighting crew. Behind her, still firmly attached to the velvet chair, sat a jagged, ruined square of expensive white lace, proudly displaying the violet medical cushion hidden underneath. A collective, horrified gasp echoed across the grand ballroom. 300 guests froze in shock, their champagne flutes hovering midway to their mouths. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Monica whipped her head around, her eyes locking onto the chair. I watched the exact millisecond her brain processed the visual evidence. She saw the familiar violet silk peeking through the torn satin and realized her malicious trap had ensnared the wrong victim. A primal, ear-piercing scream erupted from her throat. It was not a cry of embarrassment, but a shriek of unadulterated feral rage. She began trembling violently, her face contorting into a mask of pure hysteria. She thrashed against Lee, who was frantically trying to remove his tuxedo jacket to drape over her exposed back. Monica swatted his hands away, hyperventilating, as tears of mascara-stained fury streamed down her cheeks. Her bridesmaids rushed the stage, forming a frantic human shield around her as they quickly ushered her toward the side exit. The wedding planner frantically signaled the DJ to resume the music, but the damage was irreversible. Whispers and murmurs swept through the crowd like a wildfire. I remained standing near the lobby doors, keeping my expression entirely neutral as the chaotic procession shoved past me into the corridor. Bradley lingered behind the retreating bridesmaids, his eyes scanning the room until they landed directly on me. His face morphed from confusion into a dark, brewing storm of misplaced anger. He marched deliberately toward the exit, his heavy footsteps thudding against the marble tiles. I stepped back into the secluded, dimly lit hallway just outside the main ballroom, anticipating his arrival. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind me, muting the chaotic murmurs of the guests. Bradley cornered me against the textured wallpaper, his chest heaving with erratic, angry breaths. He pointed a trembling finger inches from my face, completely abandoning any pretense of respect. "You did this," he hissed, his voice vibrating with a venomous intensity. "You swapped the cushions. You intentionally ruined my wife's special day to make a sick point." I looked at the boy I had raised, noting the aggressive posture and the blind accusation in his eyes. I did not raise my voice, nor did I shrink away from his aggressive stance. My tone remained perfectly level, sharp and cold as winter ice. "I simply moved Patricia's medical equipment to a different chair," I replied, staring unblinking into his furious eyes. I did absolutely nothing to the fabric of that dress. The destruction of that gown was caused entirely by an industrial adhesive. Bradley slammed his fist against the wall, rattling a decorative sconce. He demanded I walk back into that ballroom right now, grab a microphone, and issue a public apology to Monica for humiliating her in front of her entire family. The sheer audacity of his demand extinguished any lingering ounce of paternal warmth in my heart. I pulled my phone from my inner pocket, bypassing his tantrum entirely. I calmly informed him that his new wife had spent the cocktail hour in the bridal suite, gleefully emptying a tube of commercial-grade cyanoacrylate onto the only item keeping his mother out of agonizing pain. I detailed the exact conversation I had overheard, recounting her specific, malicious intent to tear Patricia's dress and humiliate her disabled mother-in-law for a cheap thrill. Bradley blinked the information, hitting him directly in the face. For a fleeting second, I saw genuine doubt cross his features. He knew Monica was vain, and deep down he knew she was cruel. But accepting that truth meant accepting that he had married a monster, and it meant defending his sick mother against his glamorous new bride. I watched his jaw clench as he made a conscious, deliberate choice to reject reality. He shook his head violently in denial, his eyes hardening into defensive slits. "You are lying!" He spat, his voice dropping to a low, desperate growl. "Monica would never do something so deranged. You just hate her because she is not old money. You have always looked down on her, and now you are fabricating this insane story to justify your psychotic behavior." The fracture occurred right then, cracking audibly in the space between us. He had chosen his allegiance, completely abandoning the woman who gave him life. 7 months after the catastrophic wedding reception, Bradley called me with news of Monica expecting their first child. Despite the deepening chasm between us, the prospect of a grandchild compelled me to make a monumental financial gesture. I purchased a sprawling 6-bedroom estate in the exclusive Oak Brook enclave. The price tag was precisely $2,800,000. I paid the entire amount in a single wire transfer. However, decades in the corporate logistics sector had honed my survival instincts. I quietly instructed Mitchell Pierce to register the deed exclusively under my name, Harrison Caldwell. They were granted keys and a pristine address, but not an ounce of legal equity. Almost immediately upon moving in, Monica transformed her pregnancy into an impenetrable shield and brutal weapon. She weaponized her physical discomfort to reduce my son to a glorified domestic servant. Bradley was forced to abandon crucial executive meetings at my firm to fetch specific brands of imported sparkling water or to massage her ankles. If he hesitated, she would launch into theatrical crying spells, clutching her stomach and accusing him of endangering the baby through sheer neglect. He capitulated every single time, abandoning his dignity to appease a woman who thrived on his absolute subjugation. The true extent of her cruelty materialized when she unilaterally banned Patricia from stepping foot onto the Oak Brook property. Monica claimed the sight of a wheelchair damaged the aesthetic flow of her newly decorated hardwood floors, and that the presence of illness was a toxic energy for her unborn child. My wife, whose health was rapidly deteriorating, was forced to view the ultrasound sonograms through a digital tablet screen in our living room. Bradley allowed this banishment to stand, murmuring pathetic excuses about keeping his pregnant wife stress-free. That cowardly compliance severed the final fraying thread of my paternal leniency. The boiling point arrived on a Tuesday evening in late November. A severe thunderstorm was battering the greater Chicago area, flooding the highways and knocking out power lines across the suburbs. Bradley had foolishly left a highly sensitive portfolio of international vendor contracts on his office desk. The documents required his immediate physical signature for an early morning compliance audit. Knowing his utter incompetence would jeopardize a $10 million logistics merger, I retrieved the leather binder and drove through the torrential downpour toward their Oak Brook estate, planning only to drop the files at the front door. I steered my vehicle through the towering wrought iron gates of the property, the headlights cutting through the blinding rain. As I approached the circular cobblestone driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar black Suburban pulling up to the main portico. The vehicle bore the illuminated decal of a premium ride-share service. It was past midnight on a Tuesday. Bradley explicitly told me earlier that afternoon that Monica was on strict bed rest, suffering from severe maternal exhaustion. I parked in the shadows near the manicured hedges, cutting my engine and headlights to observe the unfolding scene completely undetected. The rear door of the ride-share vehicle swung open, and Monica stumbled out into the freezing rain. She was not wearing maternity clothes or resting in bed. She wore a tight sequined nightclub dress that offered zero protection against the bitter November wind. She could barely stand upright. Her designer heels scraped violently against the wet cobblestones as she leaned heavily against the side of the vehicle for support. The driver rolled down his window, tossing her a soaked designer clutch before speeding away into the storm, leaving her swaying dangerously on the steps of the mansion. I stepped out of my car, the icy rain soaking through my overcoat, and walked deliberately toward the grand entryway. As I closed the distance, the harsh glow of the porch lights illuminated the horrifying reality of her condition. Her pupils were dilated to the point where her eyes looked completely black. A distinct powdery white residue coated the edge of her left nostril, washed down her cheek by the driving rain. Her jaw clenched erratically, grinding in a classic, unmistakable symptom of heavy narcotic consumption. She was 6 months pregnant, and she was dangerously, undeniably high on illicit stimulants. She finally noticed me standing at the base of the marble steps. Instead of showing an ounce of maternal shame or panic, a crooked, arrogant smirk spread across her face. "Well, if it is not the old man spying on me in the dark." She slurred, her words running together in a chaotic, chemical-fueled rush. She fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice onto the wet stone. She leaned over the railing, pointing a shaking manicured finger at my chest. "You cannot touch me, Harrison. You cannot do a single thing, because I am carrying the golden heir." Her chemical arrogance unleashed a stream of reckless confessions. Shouting over the thunder, she bragged about how untouchable she was because of her grandfather's trust fund. I learned right then that she was poised to inherit $7 million upon her 32nd birthday, but the inheritance came with a strict morality clause. The trust mandated mandatory random drug testing. If caught abusing narcotics, the fortune would be liquidated and donated to charity. She laughed maniacally, boasting that Bradley was sleeping like an idiot, unaware she had spent the evening snorting away her boredom in a private lounge downtown. I did not yell. I did not attempt to grab her or shake sense into her chemically altered brain. Screaming at a pregnant woman high on cocaine in the middle of a thunderstorm would yield zero tactical advantage. I simply stood in the pouring rain, analyzing the magnificent, devastating weapon she had just handed me. Bradley was inside, comfortably asleep, ignorant that his unborn child was swimming in a toxic cocktail of heavy narcotics. I was funding a lifestyle that was actively poisoning his own legacy. I turned around and slowly walked back to my car in absolute deadly silence. I stood in the pouring rain, watching Monica fumble with the heavy brass door handle, completely unable to insert the key into the lock. Her movements were jagged, uncoordinated, and desperate. She cursed loudly, dropping her designer clutch onto the wet marble steps. Her erratic behavior confirmed my suspicions. She was entirely unfit to manage a household, let alone a newborn child. I decided to intervene before she woke Bradley and escalated the situation. Approaching the porch, I kept my distance, my voice calm but authoritative. "Let me open the door, Monica. You are in no condition to manage this alone." She whipped around, her eyes wide with chemically induced paranoia. "Don't you touch me, Harrison," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "I don't need your help. I don't need anything from you." I ignored her outburst and stepped forward, picking up the keys from the puddle. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pushed it open, allowing her to stumble inside. The grand foyer of the Oakbrook mansion was dimly lit, the shadows casting long, sinister shapes against the pristine white walls. Monica leaned heavily against the mahogany banister of the sweeping staircase, breathing heavily, her mascara smeared across her pale face. Bradley appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a silk robe and looking disoriented. He rubbed his eyes, trying to focus on the scene below. "What is going on down there?" He mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Before I could answer, Monica launched into a hysterical tirade. "Your father is trying to control me again," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He was spying on me in the dark, waiting to attack me." Bradley rushed down the stairs, his concern immediately shifting toward Monica. He wrapped an arm around her, supporting her weight. "Dad." "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone defensive. I stood my ground, my expression stony. "I came to drop off the firm documents you irresponsibly left behind," I explained, holding up the leather binder. "And I found your wife stumbling out of a rideshare vehicle, heavily intoxicated and clearly under the influence of narcotics." Bradley's eyes darted from me to Monica, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But the denial quickly set in. He tightened his grip on her, refusing to accept the reality right in front of him. "You're lying," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "Monica would never do something like that. She's pregnant." I gestured toward Monica's face, her erratic jaw movements and dilated pupils providing undeniable evidence. "Look at her, Bradley." I urged, my voice laced with a mixture of pity and frustration. "She is high. She is endangering the life of your unborn child." The accusation triggered a violent reaction in Monica. She wrenched herself from Bradley's grasp, her face contorting into a mask of pure fury. "You old bastard!" she shrieked, launching herself forward. She swung a clumsy punch aimed at my chest, but her chemically altered coordination betrayed her. Her heel caught on the edge of the marble stair, and she lost her footing entirely. She tumbled backward, a sickening tangle of limbs and sequined fabric, crashing against the mahogany banister. She rolled down the remaining 5 steps, her body hitting the polished floor with a dull thud. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips, quickly followed by a terrifying, absolute silence. Bradley let out a horrified scream and scrambled down the stairs, falling to his knees beside her motionless body. "Monica," he sobbed, his hands hovering over her, unsure of what to do. "Call an ambulance." I immediately pulled out my phone and dialed emergency services, my mind racing through the chaotic sequence of events. The paramedics arrived within minutes, loading Monica onto a stretcher and rushing her to the nearest hospital. I followed closely behind in my car, an impending sense of dread settling heavily in my gut. At the hospital, the stark reality of the situation crashed down upon us. A somber-faced doctor approached us in the waiting room, his expression conveying the devastating news. "I'm incredibly sorry," he began, his voice low and sympathetic. "Monica has suffered a miscarriage. The trauma from the fall was too severe." Bradley collapsed into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. As loud sobs racked his body, I placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support, but he violently shrugged it off. "This is your fault," he yelled, his face contorted with grief and misplaced anger. "If you hadn't been there, none of this would have happened." The doctor raised a hand, calling for calm. "There is something else you need to know," he continued, his tone turning clinical. "We ran a routine toxicity panel on Monica. The results showed dangerous levels of cocaine and amphetamines in her bloodstream." The revelation hit Bradley like a physical blow. He stared at the doctor, completely stunned, unable to process the information. The doctor gently explained the severe risks associated with narcotic use during pregnancy, highlighting the devastating impact it had likely played in the miscarriage. I stood in silence, the truth echoing in the sterile hospital corridor. Monica had not only endangered her unborn child, but her reckless behavior had ultimately led to its demise. The tragic loss was compounded by a chilling realization. Monica's grandfather, a wealthy industrialist, had established a $7 million trust fund for her. However, the inheritance was contingent upon strict adherence to a morality clause. She was required to undergo random drug testing. If caught abusing narcotics, the fortune would be liquidated and donated to charity. Monica was cornered. The toxicity report was an undeniable piece of evidence, a permanent record of her substance abuse. The loss of her child was a tragedy, but the loss of her impending fortune was a catastrophe she would never willingly accept. I watched Bradley slowly process the devastating reality, his mind struggling to reconcile the grieving mother with the reckless addict. The seeds of a vile, desperate plan were already taking root in the darkness of Monica's mind. The silence of the hospital waiting area shattered when a nurse summoned us into the recovery suite. Monica lay propped against the pillows, her eyes darting frantically. The attending physician had just delivered a stark ultimatum regarding her toxicology results. Protocol required the hospital to notify social services, inevitably triggering an audit from her family trust administrators. Panic stripped away her grief. Dismissing the medical staff, she demanded total privacy. She grabbed Bradley by his shirt collar, outlining exactly how they were going to spin the narrative to save her $7 million inheritance. Her desperate logic was terrifyingly simple. If the fall was an accident caused by her intoxication, she would lose everything. However, if she was the victim of an unprovoked assault, the resulting trauma would grant her immediate victim status, effectively shielding her medical records behind an ongoing criminal investigation. She looked directly at my son and delivered an ultimatum. He either corroborated a story where I intentionally attacked her, or she would divorce him, ensuring he never saw a dime of the wealth. I watched the moral collapse of a man happen in real time as Bradley slowly nodded, disgusted beyond words. I turned on my heel and walked out of the suite, navigating the clinical corridors toward the underground parking garage. The damp concrete structure was entirely deserted. I unlocked my vehicle, eager to return to Patricia, when a sudden heavy footfall echoed behind me. Bradley sprinted out of the stairwell, his face flushed, cutting off my path to the driver's side door. He stepped into my personal space, his breathing erratic. He did not ask for my help. He demanded my compliance. He insisted that I go to the local precinct and sign a confession stating I had accidentally bumped into Monica during a heated argument. He claimed a misdemeanor charge would result in probation for a man of my age, completely ignoring that he was asking me to admit to a violent crime. I flatly rejected his absurd proposal, making it clear that I would never perjure myself to cover for an addict. The rejection flipped a dangerous switch inside his mind. Bradley lunged forward, closing the remaining distance between us. Before I could raise my hands defensively, he grabbed my left forearm with a vice-like grip. His fingernails dug viciously through the fabric of my overcoat, ripping into my bare skin. He dragged his hand downward with brutal force, leaving 4 deep, bleeding gouges across my flesh. I shoved him backward, stunned by the assault. Bradley stumbled backward intentionally, throwing his own weight against a concrete support pillar. He slammed his shoulder into the rough surface, tearing his silk shirt and scraping his cheek until it bled. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he dialed emergency services right in front of me. I listened in absolute horror as he fed the dispatcher a fabricated, hysterical narrative, screaming into the receiver that his father had just assaulted him after confessing to attempting to murder his pregnant wife. I realized then that reasoning with him was entirely futile. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove out of the garage, heading straight for my own neighborhood. I needed to reach my house, secure my legal documents, and prepare Patricia for the inevitable fallout of this fabricated crime. The drive was a blur of rain-slicked roads and blinding headlights. I pulled into my driveway. Inside, Patricia was awake in her medical bed, her fragile chest rising and falling to the rhythmic hum of her oxygen concentrator. I knelt beside her, taking her frail, trembling hands into mine. I began to speak in a hushed tone, attempting to explain the sheer magnitude of the betrayal that had just transpired. I needed her to understand that I was innocent, no matter what the authorities would claim by morning. The sudden explosion of heavy fists pounding against my solid oak front door cut my explanation short. The flashing red and blue strobe lights from multiple cruisers sliced through the living room curtains. I stood up slowly, raising my hands as the heavy door was forced open. 4 uniformed officers and 2 plainclothes detectives swarmed into my foyer, their heavy tactical boots tracking wet mud across the polished hardwood floor. A detective stepped forward, unholstering his handcuffs. He read me my Miranda rights in a rapid, practiced monotone, informing me that I was being placed under arrest for aggravated battery and suspected attempted manslaughter. They forced my arms behind my back, the cold steel biting into my wrists, pressing directly against the bleeding scratches Bradley had inflicted. The physical pain was sharp, but it paled in comparison to the psychological torment. Patricia cried out from her bed, a weak, devastated sound that shattered my heart. She reached a trembling arm toward me, her monitors beeping erratically as her heart rate spiked in sheer terror. I pleaded with the officers to let me comfort her, but they yanked me backward, ignoring my requests. They treated me like a hardened criminal, pushing me toward the open doorway. Bradley walked through the front door, just as they were hauling me into the foyer. He stood beside the lead detective, his torn shirt and bruised cheek perfectly corroborating his fabricated struggle. He did not look at his dying mother crying in the corner. He locked his eyes directly onto the detective. He spoke with a chilling precision, committing absolute perjury. He swore under oath that he had stood at the top of the grand staircase and watched me intentionally shove his wife backward into the abyss. The detectives nodded, securing his sworn statement on their notepads. They dragged me out into the freezing downpour, shoving me heavily into the back of a waiting squad car. Through the rain-streaked window, I looked back at my home. I saw the silhouette of my son standing safely inside the warm foyer, securing his stolen wealth by burying his innocent father alive. The arraignment hearing was a blur of fluorescent lights and the echoing slam of a judge's gavel. I stood before the bench, the scratches on my wrists throbbing beneath the metal cuffs, formally entering a plea of not guilty. The trial date was set for 6 months out. I posted the $200,000 bail secured against my personal assets and walked out of the courthouse with Mitchell Pierce trailing right behind me. We had less than half a year to build an impenetrable defense against my own son. Mitchell immediately hired a team of private investigators to canvass the Oak Brook neighborhood. They interviewed every neighbor within a 3-block radius, hoping someone's security camera had captured Monica stumbling out of the rideshare vehicle. They found absolutely nothing. The driving rain had obscured the lenses, and the specific rideshare driver had deactivated his account the very next morning, vanishing entirely from the system. The physical evidence was minimal, boiling down to Bradley's bruised cheek, my scratched arm, and a staircase. The entire case rested heavily on sworn testimonies. The prosecution's strategy became terrifyingly clear during the discovery phase. They submitted their official witness list, and right at the top, just below Bradley and Monica, was Patricia Caldwell. The prosecutor, a ruthless young attorney named Vance, planned to subpoena my dying wife. His strategy was brutal. He intended to paint me as an emotionally volatile man, claiming the stress of caring for a terminally ill spouse had caused me to snap and violently assault my pregnant daughter-in-law. Bradley called my cell phone a week after the witness list was released. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask how his mother was coping. He delivered a cold, calculated threat. He boasted that he had spent 3 hours prepping the prosecutor on Patricia's exact medical condition. He explicitly detailed how the stress of cross-examination would likely trigger a fatal neurological collapse. He offered to drop the aggravated battery charges and advocate for a lighter sentence, but only if I immediately surrendered my controlling shares in the logistics firm to him. I hung up the phone without saying a single word. I immediately drove to Mitchell's downtown office. We sat in his leather chairs, analyzing the grim reality of the situation. Mitchell explained the mechanics of the subpoena process. Patricia could not simply refuse to testify. If she failed to appear, she would be held in contempt of court. The prosecution would forcefully depose her from her medical bed, dragging her through a grueling, hours-long interrogation about my supposed violent tendencies. The sheer physiological stress of defending me against our own son would undoubtedly kill her long before a verdict was reached. We considered counter-strategies. We could present the hospital's toxicology report to the jury, proving Monica was severely intoxicated during the fall. However, the judge had already ruled that the report was inadmissible as character evidence. The prosecution successfully argued that her substance abuse did not legally justify a physical assault. The jury would only be allowed to consider the events that occurred on the staircase guided by the sworn perjury of my son. We were walking blindly into a trap meticulously designed to destroy my family. Mitchell poured 2 glasses of scotch, handing one to me. He laid out the absolute worst-case scenario. If we went to trial and lost, I was facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a state penitentiary. I would die in prison. Patricia would die alone, leaving the entire $60 million estate wide open for Bradley and Monica to claim through probate court. They would inherit everything built on the foundation of my wrongful conviction. I then presented the only viable alternative, a plea deal. The prosecution was willing to reduce the charges to involuntary manslaughter, dropping the aggravated battery entirely. The sentence would be reduced to 24 months in a minimum security facility, minus time served for good behavior. The catch was absolute. I had to stand before the judge and publicly admit to a crime I never committed. I had to state on the permanent record that I recklessly caused the death of my unborn grandchild. I drove home that evening, the weight of the decision crushing my chest. I parked in the driveway and sat in the dark for over an hour, staring at the warm glow of the living room window. Inside, Patricia was resting her fragile life, hanging by a thread. I walked through the front door and sat beside her medical bed. She reached out her thin fingers, grazing my cheek. She looked into my eyes and whispered that she believed me, that she knew the man she married would never hurt a pregnant woman. I kissed her forehead, fighting back tears. I told her I loved her more than my own freedom. I promised her I would do whatever it took to keep her safe from the nightmare Bradley had created. I did not tell her about the subpoena. I did not tell her about the plea deal. I simply held her hand until she fell asleep, knowing it would be one of the last peaceful nights we would ever share. The next morning, I returned to Mitchell's office and signed the paperwork. I agreed to accept the plea deal, effectively trading 2 years of my life to shield Patricia from the lethal crossfire of a courtroom battle. Mitchell filed the documents with the court that same afternoon. The date for the formal sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week. The courtroom was packed on the day of my sentencing. Bradley and Monica sat in the front row, holding hands, performing the role of grieving parents flawlessly for the local press. I stood before the judge, my voice steady, and uttered the words that legally destroyed my reputation. I plead guilty, Your Honor. The gavel slammed down, echoing through the chamber. The judge sentenced me to 2 years in the Illinois State Penitentiary. Bailiffs moved in instantly, securing my wrists in heavy metal cuffs. As they led me away to begin my sentence, I locked eyes with Bradley one final time, silently vowing that this temporary defeat would be the catalyst for his absolute permanent ruin. The brutal, jarring transition into general population at the Illinois State Penitentiary quickly stripped away the last remnants of my former identity. My completely new reality consisted of a 6 by 8 foot concrete cell, a cold steel bunk, and the relentless noise of 2,000 incarcerated men. I secured a job in the industrial laundry facility, folding coarse uniform shirts for 30 cents an hour, just to keep my hands moving. The manual labor provided a necessary distraction from the suffocating anxiety regarding Patricia and her failing health. Winter arrived, dropping the temperature inside the cell block to near freezing. I learned to sleep fully clothed, wrapping my thin wool blanket tightly around my shoulders. I avoided the yard politics entirely, eating my meals in silence and retreating to my bunk the moment the lockdown klaxons sounded. Mitchell sent me weekly letters through the legal mail system, keeping me updated on my wife, but the updates grew increasingly grim as the weeks turned into months. On my 184th day of incarceration, the routine abruptly shattered. A head correctional officer unlocked my cell door immediately following the morning head count, instructing me to follow him to the administrative wing. The warden was waiting for me inside his wood-paneled office, a stark contrast to the sterile concrete of the cell blocks. He pushed a heavy black telephone across his desk, his expression grim and completely unreadable. The voice on the other end belonged to the head palliative care nurse at the hospice facility. Patricia had suffered complete respiratory failure at 3:14 that morning. She passed away quietly in her sleep, completely alone in her medical bed. The nurse gently explained that Bradley and Monica had specifically instructed the medical staff not to notify anyone until the morning shift arrived. The warden denied my request for a temporary compassionate furlough to attend her burial, citing standard state regulations for my security classification. I was forced to mourn my wife of 40 years while sitting on a steel toilet in a locked cage. The isolation magnified the grief, twisting the profound sorrow into a dark, hardened knot deep within my chest. Within 48 hours, Bradley hijacked the entire mourning process. Instead of organizing a respectful service at her lifelong parish, he scheduled a lavish memorial at an exclusive downtown country club. It was a calculated networking event disguised as a funeral, designed entirely to impress his high society peers and wealthy corporate investors. Monica hired armed private security contractors to guard the country club entrances. She provided them with the strict blacklist containing the names of Patricia's closest friends, my loyal board members, and my attorney. Anyone who might question their narrative or demand transparency regarding my wife was physically barred from entering the premises and threatened with trespassing charges. The moment the memorial concluded, their aggressive asset grab officially commenced. Bradley dispatched a team of locksmiths to change every deadbolt on our primary residence. He unilaterally moved the logistics company headquarters to a lavish new downtown high-rise, signing a 10-year commercial lease using emergency executive powers. Their audacity reached a new peak on the first Sunday of the following month. The cell block guard called my name over the intercom, announcing I had visitors waiting in the main reception hall. I walked to the heavy steel door, peering through the reinforced glass window. Bradley and Monica were sitting at a steel table wearing custom-tailored black clothing, displaying expressions of manufactured solemnity for the surveillance cameras. I knew they had not come to offer condolences. Mitchell had smuggled a coded message to me, hidden inside a thick stack of printed case law precedents. Bradley desperately needed my master digital passkeys and secondary biometric authentication codes to unlock the offshore holding accounts I had established a decade ago. He was masquerading his blatant greed under the guise of managing the estate and settling Patricia's outstanding medical debts. I stared through the scratched glass at the two people who had destroyed my life. I did not tap on the window. I did not pick up the visitation phone. I turned to the nearest correctional officer and requested a permanent visitation block form. I signed my name decisively across the dotted line, legally revoking their clearance to ever enter the facility again. They refused to accept my silence. When their physical access was denied, they resorted to exploiting the institutional mail system. Envelopes marked as urgent legal correspondence began arriving at my cell every Tuesday. The prison staff was legally obligated to deliver them unopened, assuming they contained vital trial documents or appeals paperwork. Inside those envelopes, I found glossy photographs printed on heavy premium paper. Monica sent pictures of her lounging by the newly renovated pool at my estate, sipping champagne while wearing Patricia's vintage diamond jewelry. Bradley sent copies of the exorbitant catering receipts from the country club, funeral highlighting the total cost in bright red ink just to mock my absolute helplessness. They believed the psychological warfare would break my spirit and force my compliance. They assumed the crushing combination of grief, isolation, and constant taunting would eventually make me surrender the digital passwords just to buy a moment of peace. Every single photograph they sent, and every single taunting letter they maliciously mailed only fueled the raging fire burning inside my mind. The tears I shed for Patricia eventually dried, leaving behind a profound, terrifying clarity. I stopped reading their letters, tossing them directly into the trash bin beneath my steel sink. I stopped counting the days I had been locked away and started counting the days until my release. The darkness of the prison became my sanctuary, the perfect environment to forge an absolute flawless strategy. I transformed my profound isolation into a powerful, unstoppable weapon, carefully preparing to unleash a completely devastating, irreversible reckoning upon the very people who foolishly thought they had successfully buried me alive beneath their lies. Mitchell Pierce arrived on the second Tuesday of the month, his expression tight and unreadable beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the attorney-client visitation room. The space was a sterile, soundproof box, equipped with a single metal table bolted to the floor, explicitly designed to ensure maximum privacy. As soon as the heavy steel door locked behind him, Mitchell dropped his thick leather briefcase onto the table. He did not waste a single second with pleasantries or sympathetic inquiries about my physical well-being. He immediately extracted a massive stack of documents, each bound with intimidating red legal tape, and slid them across the cold metal surface. These are ostensibly the appellate briefs for your post-conviction relief petition. Mitchell stated, his voice barely above a whisper, intentionally performing for the overhead surveillance cameras. But I strongly advise you to review the addendums hidden in Section 4. I pulled the heavy stack toward me, my calloused hands leaving faint smudges on the pristine white paper. The cover pages were indeed filled with dense, impenetrable legal jargon concerning sentencing guidelines and constitutional precedents. However, as I flipped to the middle of the stack, the true nature of the documents was revealed. The hidden pages were comprehensive financial audits of Caldwell Logistics. They were detailed balance sheets, vendor payment ledgers, and offshore routing summaries, all meticulously compiled by a rogue forensic accountant Mitchell had secretly retained. I scanned the first ledger, my eyes immediately locking onto a series of staggering, irregular disbursements. The numbers were catastrophic. In the past 8 months alone, over $5 million had been bled directly from the firm's operational accounts. Mitchell leaned closer, tapping a specific column of numbers with his silver pen. I highlighted the anomalies. Bradley enacted the emergency temporary power of attorney less than 48 hours after you signed the plea deal. The document was intended solely to authorize payroll and sign critical shipping manifests while you were incarcerated. Instead, he completely hijacked the executive financial controls. I traced the flow of the stolen capital following the money trail printed on the page. The funds were not being diverted into Bradley's personal checking accounts, nor were they being used to purchase tangible assets like real estate or luxury vehicles that could be easily traced by the IRS. Instead, the money was being aggressively funneled into a labyrinth of newly established vendor contracts. "These are phantom vendors," I murmured, recognizing the distinct pattern of corporate embezzlement immediately. Bradley is authorizing massive payments for logistics, software upgrades, consulting fees, and international freight insurance to companies that literally did not exist 3 months ago. Mitchell nodded grimly, flipping to the final page of the audit. My investigator dug into the corporate registrations of those specific vendors. They are shell companies, Harrison. All of them are registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands under strict anonymity clauses. But we managed to penetrate the corporate veil of one entity, Apex Consulting Solutions, which received a staggering $800,000 payment last week. I stared at the registration document. Mitchell pushed toward me. The listed executive director for Apex Consulting Solutions was an individual named Eleanor Harper. My mind raced trying to connect the name to anyone in our corporate network before the realization hit me like a physical blow. Harper was Monica's younger sister, the same bridesmaid who had planted the glued cushion at the wedding. "Monica is the architect behind the shell companies," I said, my voice hardening into a cold, lethal whisper. "Bradley is using his unmonitored access as acting CEO to authorize the fraudulent payments, and Monica is catching the money offshore using her sister's identity as a legal shield. They are systematically liquidating your legacy." Mitchell confirmed, his tone devoid of any sugarcoating. "If they maintain this aggressive pace of embezzlement, Caldwell Logistics will experience a catastrophic cash flow crisis within 14 months. They will inevitably default on the primary union contracts, the board will panic, and the company will be forced into a hostile bankruptcy. They are bleeding the beast dry before it collapses. The sheer audacity of the scheme was staggering. They were not merely stealing from me. They were actively destroying the livelihoods of over 400 loyal employees who depended on my firm for their survival. I closed the audit file, carefully sliding it back beneath the protective cover of the appellate briefs. The overwhelming grief I had carried since Patricia's death instantly evaporated entirely, replaced by a singular, hyper-focused objective. I need complete access to the offshore routing numbers. I commanded, locking eyes with my attorney. I need the exact dates of the transfers, the IP addresses used to authorize the payments, and every single digital footprint Bradley has left on the company servers. Mitchell hesitated, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Harrison, if you try to intervene from in here, the prison authorities will intercept your communications. Bradley will realize you are auditing him, and he will immediately destroy the server logs to cover his tracks. You are legally powerless until your sentence is complete. I am powerless only if I attempt to stop him legally. I countered, a dangerous, calculated plan forming in my mind. I do not want to stop him, Mitchell. I want you to let him keep stealing. I want him to drain another $5 million if he feels bold enough. Mitchell stared at me, visibly confused by the sudden strategic pivot. You want them to completely bankrupt your life's work? No, I replied, a chilling smile touching the corners of my mouth for the first time in over a year. I want them to accumulate a mountain of federal evidence so massive that no defense attorney on earth can save them. You are going to quietly feed this audit trail directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mitchell slowly withdrew a second, much thinner manila envelope from the hidden compartment of his briefcase. He slid it across the bolted steel table, his cautious eyes darting toward the overhead surveillance camera before finally meeting my intense gaze. This file had absolutely nothing to do with corporate ledgers or offshore routing numbers. It contained heavily redacted medical evaluation forms, all carrying the official watermark of a highly prominent private psychiatric clinic located deep in downtown Chicago. I rapidly scanned the first page, my peripheral vision narrowing completely on the stark, terrifying clinical assessments printed in heavy black ink. The documents diagnosed me with rapid-onset vascular dementia and severe cognitive decline, completely fabricating a history of aggressive paranoia. A corrupt, highly paid physician whose elaborate signature adorned the very bottom of each page had already rubber-stamped a preliminary medical affidavit. Bradley had literally purchased a fraudulent medical profile to legally erase my entire autonomy. The sheer brutal mechanics of their ambush materialized perfectly clearly as I read through the dense attached legal petition. My treacherous son intended to execute a forced guardianship order the exact moment I stepped past the penitentiary gates. They had already arranged for a private medical transport unit to be waiting alongside their luxury vehicle on my designated release date. The sinister plan was to bypass my freedom entirely, hauling me directly into a locked memory care ward under the sickening guise of familial duty. This forced guardianship strategy carried an immediate, devastating secondary objective regarding my personal residential real estate. The thick petition included a highly specific clause allowing the newly appointed guardian to liquidate dormant assets to fund my supposed long-term care. Bradley had already preemptively drafted the preliminary transfer deeds for the massive Oak Brook mansion. They were planning to sell the property to a blind trust controlled entirely by Monica, effectively laundering the house through a completely legitimate medical expense loophole. Mitchell then slowly revealed the final updated aggregate of their massive corporate pillaging. The total sum siphoned from the international logistics firm had officially crossed $5.4 million as of that exact morning. The most recent $400,000 offshore withdrawal was particularly grotesque and disturbing. They had purposefully routed the capital through a fake philanthropic foundation dedicated to neurological research, actively exploiting my late wife's terminal illness to mask their ultimate cash grab. I pushed the psychiatric files back toward Mitchell, my hands completely steady. I instructed him to immediately establish a secure, unrecorded line of communication with his contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was to operate as my sole proxy, feeding them the specific routing numbers of the fake charity and the name of the corrupt psychiatrist. We were no longer just building a standard corporate fraud case. We were meticulously assembling a massive, multi-count federal indictment, including gross medical conspiracy and international wire fraud. The allotted visitation hour finally expired, and a heavy-set armed guard closely escorted me back to the confines of cell block D. The harsh environment around me felt entirely different as the solid steel door violently slammed shut. The damp, freezing air and the lingering scent of industrial bleach no longer felt like a punishment. The barren concrete walls officially transformed into a highly secure, undisturbed war room where my numerous enemies could not monitor my specific movements or anticipate my lethal retaliation. I sat down heavily on the edge of my thin mattress and immediately pulled out a yellow standard-issue legal pad. I absolutely could not risk writing down explicit tactical instructions or target names during the regular weekly cell inspections. I began developing a complex cipher based on the pagination of the federal tax code books available in the prison library. Every numeric sequence of numbers I mailed to Mitchell, disguised as innocent appeals research, would directly correlate to a specific tactical maneuver regarding the impending federal sting. My first encrypted directive mapped out the internal hierarchy of my own board of directors. Bradley could not authorize millions in fake vendor payments without an inside accomplice approving the quarterly expense reports. I identified the chief financial officer as his primary conspirator. I tasked the federal agents with tapping the CFO's personal communications, knowing the coward would eventually slip up and provide the necessary probable cause for a wiretap warrant. The profound, crushing grief that had paralyzed me since losing Patricia began to mutate. The paralyzing sorrow crystallized into a sharp, weaponized focus. Every memory of her suffering and every thought of the indignity she faced at the hands of those monsters poured high-octane fuel onto the blazing fire of my vengeance. I no longer mourned. I plotted with the ruthless clinical precision of an apex predator hunting its prey. I began synchronizing the federal investigation with the exact timeline of my remaining sentence. I had exactly 180 days left until my mandatory release. I instructed the lead FBI investigator through my ciphered letters to let the embezzlement continue unabated. They needed the monetary theft to cross the $5 million federal threshold to trigger mandatory maximum sentencing guidelines under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. I spent the dark, silent hours of the night running every possible variable of the upcoming confrontation. I anticipated Bradley's lies, Monica's theatrical panic, and the exact legal maneuvers their defense attorneys would attempt. I fortified every vulnerability in my strategy, ensuring that when the trap finally snapped shut, it would sever every single avenue of escape. The transformation within me was absolute and irreversible. The trusting father who had bought a $2 million mansion for his ungrateful son ceased to exist entirely. The grieving widower who had accepted a plea deal to protect his family died in that 6-by-8-foot cage. I became an architect of pure, unadulterated ruin, meticulously laying the groundwork to obliterate the two people who foolishly believed they had buried me alive. The encoded letters containing my precise tactical directives bypassed the prison mail sensors flawlessly. Mitchell decoded the complex numeric sequences using the predetermined federal tax statutes, extracting the highly sensitive digital evidence I had meticulously assembled. Acting as my sole proxy, he formally bypassed standard local law enforcement and submitted a classified whistleblower report directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The gravity of the financial theft warranted immediate federal intervention, prompting the IRS to silently loop in the Federal Bureau of Investigation under a heavily sealed docket. A clandestine meeting was swiftly arranged in a secure subterranean parking garage beneath the federal courthouse. Mitchell handed over 3 encrypted flash drives directly to Special Agent Elias Thorne, a veteran investigator heading the white-collar crime syndicate division. The drives contained the undeniable proof of my son's illicit activities. They held the exact digital IP addresses Bradley used to bypass the corporate firewall high-resolution scans of the forged executive signatures, and the specific offshore routing numbers tracing directly to Monica's Cayman Island shell accounts. Agent Thorne allocated an elite team of forensic data analysts to authenticate the smuggled files. Within 48 hours, the federal technicians verified every single fraudulent transaction. The sheer magnitude of the international wire transfers immediately triggered a joint task force protocol, quietly bringing agents from the Department of Homeland Security into the fold to monitor the cross-border capital flight. The government now possessed a perfectly wrapped, airtight racketeering case handed to them on a silver platter. The overwhelming clarity of the evidence provoked an aggressive response from the federal task force. Agent Thorne contacted Mitchell via a secure line, insisting on launching an immediate full-scale tactical raid on the corporate headquarters of Caldwell Logistics. The FBI wanted to kick down the glass doors, seize the compromised servers, and arrest Bradley before another dime could be siphoned offshore. They argued that any delay presented a catastrophic flight risk, fearing Monica would liquidate the stolen assets and vanish to a non-extradition country. I anticipated their impatience and had already prepared a non-negotiable counteroffer. During our next scheduled visitation, Mitchell relayed my strict demands to the federal prosecutors. I offered to serve as the primary cooperating witness, pledging to testify in open federal court and waive all claims of executive immunity regarding the corporate negligence. However, my unprecedented cooperation hinged entirely on one absolute condition. The task force had to completely halt all overt investigative actions and delay the arrests until the exact morning of my mandatory release from the penitentiary. The federal attorneys initially balked at the audacity of an inmate dictating the operational timeline of a multi-agency sting. I instructed Mitchell to present them with the ruthless, undeniable logic of my strategy. By allowing the embezzlement to continue uninterrupted for another 5 months, the total stolen capital would inevitably eclipse the $10 million threshold. Crossing that specific financial benchmark would automatically elevate the charges to an aggravated federal felony, ensuring that neither Bradley nor Monica would ever qualify for a lenient plea deal or early parole. Agent Thorne recognized the brutal brilliance of the proposition. I was essentially offering to let my own life's work bleed out just to guarantee a maximum inescapable prison sentence for the perpetrators. The prospect of securing a flawless, high-profile conviction with the full cooperation of the company founder proved far too lucrative for the ambitious prosecutors to reject. The FBI officially agreed to my timeline, formally christening the delayed sting with a classified operational title. For the remainder of my incarceration, a terrifying invisible net tightened around my unsuspecting son. The Federal Cyber Division quietly implanted untraceable monitoring software directly into the logistics firm's mainframe. Agents watched in real time as Bradley confidently executed fraudulent wire transfers, completely unaware that the FBI was documenting his every keystroke. They placed covert digital trackers on the Cayman Island accounts, silently watching the stolen millions pool into the fake philanthropic foundation without ever alerting the international banking authorities. Empowered by their perceived invincibility, the traders aggressively escalated their reckless spending. Bradley brazenly purchased a luxury yacht, casually registering the exorbitant vessel under the firm's corporate expense ledger as a necessary client entertainment asset. He paraded his stolen wealth at elite country clubs, mingling with wealthy investors while proudly wearing custom-tailored suits purchased with the blood of my company. They were gorging themselves on a feast of stolen capital, blindly fattening the pig for the inevitable slaughter. Simultaneously, Monica accelerated her sinister medical coup. She finalized the exorbitant deposit for the high-security memory care facility where she intended to permanently lock me away. Her lawyers aggressively fast-tracked the forced guardianship paperwork, securing a corrupt judge willing to sign the medical mandate the moment my parole was processed. They meticulously arranged for a private armed medical transport team to intercept me at the prison gates, answering I would never breathe a single second of actual freedom. The prison administration eventually began processing my official impending release documents as the final few weeks slowly evaporated. I attended a mandatory final debriefing session with the warden, going through the standard bureaucratic motions of an outgoing inmate. While reviewing the standard parole forms, I discreetly signed a classified federal immunity agreement that Agent Thorne had covertly slipped into the stack of paperwork. The binding document guaranteed my absolute legal protection in exchange for my upcoming testimony. On the final night of my grueling sentence, I sat on the edge of my cold steel bunk and methodically folded my scratchy state-issued prison uniform. Every microscopic detail of the massive upcoming raid had been perfectly synchronized across 3 completely different federal agencies. The heavily armed tactical assault teams were already moving silently into strategic position across the darkened city. The board was immaculately set, the pieces were permanently locked into place, and the relentless countdown to their absolute irreversible destruction had officially reached its final glorious hours. The second day of my freedom arrived with a razor-sharp clarity. I had spent my first night out of prison meticulously reviewing the operational timeline, with Mitchell confirming that every federal agency involved in the sting was locked into their precise tactical positions. The morning air was bitterly cold as I stood before the full-length mirror in my hotel suite, shrugging off the cheap, gray, state-issued suit I had worn out of the penitentiary. In its place, I donned a charcoal, bespoke Italian wool suit that Mitchell had carefully retrieved from my personal tailor. The heavy fabric felt like armor. By 7 o'clock that evening, the sprawling Oak Brook mansion, the very house I had purchased with a single massive cash wire transfer, was completely illuminated. A fleet of luxury vehicles jammed the circular cobblestone driveway. Bradley and Monica had orchestrated a magnificent high society gala under the sickeningly transparent guise of a family bonding celebration. The entire event was a meticulously crafted public relations stunt designed exclusively to assure their nervous corporate investors and wealthy socialite friends that the Caldwell dynasty was perfectly stable despite my recent incarceration. I sat silently in the passenger seat of Mitchell's black SUV parked discreetly down the block, observing the steady stream of guests arriving at the main portico. Monica had hired a highly visible armed private security detail to guard the wrought iron gates. The imposing men in dark suits were explicitly instructed to prevent any unauthorized entry, particularly mine. However, they were completely unaware that the property deed had never been transferred out of my name. Legally, they were armed trespassers blocking the rightful owner from entering his own residence. Mitchell tapped his smartphone, sending a final encrypted text message to Agent Thorne, confirming we were initiating the approach. We stepped out of the vehicle and walked purposefully toward the grand entryway. The lead security contractor immediately stepped forward, raising a heavy hand to halt our progress. He demanded to see our physical invitations, his tone aggressive and dismissive. Mitchell did not engage in a debate. He simply withdrew a certified court-ordered injunction from his briefcase and shoved it directly against the guard's chest. The document explicitly detailed my absolute, non-negotiable legal ownership of the estate, backed by a federal mandate, granting me immediate, unrestricted access. The guard scanned the paperwork, his aggressive posture evaporating into terrified compliance. He quickly stepped aside, signaling his team to stand down entirely. I pushed the heavy oak double doors open with both hands, stepping into the massive marble-floored foyer. The interior of the mansion had been completely transformed. A live jazz band played softly from a raised platform in the grand living room, while tuxedoed waiters circulated through the crowd, with trays of expensive champagne and imported caviar. 200 members of Chicago's elite financial and social circles mingled freely, laughing and clinking glasses. Bradley stood near the grand fireplace, holding court, with a group of prominent venture capitalists. He wore a custom tuxedo, his hair perfectly slicked back, radiating the false confidence of a man who believed he had successfully stolen an empire. Monica was positioned near the extravagant buffet table, showcasing a stunning designer gown and a diamond necklace that had once belonged to Patricia. She was laughing theatrically, captivating her audience with a fabricated, tearful story about the immense emotional burden of carrying the family through my supposed criminal madness. I walked directly into the center of the grand living room, my footsteps loud and deliberate against the polished floor. Mitchell followed closely behind, carrying a thick, red legal binder. The first guest to notice my arrival was an older board member from my logistics firm. His champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering loudly against the marble. The sharp, violent sound of breaking glass acted like a gunshot in the crowded room. The jazz band faltered, the musicians lowering their instruments, as the atmosphere instantly chilled. Conversations abruptly died, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. 200 pairs of eyes slowly turned toward the entrance, locking onto the ex-convict, who had just crashed the most exclusive party of the season. Bradley froze mid-sentence, his wine glass hovering near his mouth. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. Monica whipped around, her theatrical smile instantly collapsing into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She instinctively clutched Patricia's diamond necklace, her eyes wide with panic, as she realized her private security detail had failed to stop my infiltration. I did not utter a single word as I slowly scanned the sea of horrified faces. I simply stood my ground, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying authority. The guests began to instinctively back away, creating a wide physical perimeter around me. The carefully constructed illusion of their perfect stolen life was fracturing right before their eyes, and the execution of my meticulously planned, irreversible vengeance was officially underway. Bradley detached himself from the circle of venture capitalists, his pace hurried, desperate. He approached me with forced joviality, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder, as if we were just two men sharing an inside joke. "Dad," he murmured, leaning in close so only I could hear the tremor in his voice, "let us not do this here. Let us go to the study. We can handle whatever this is quietly." I stepped out from under his hand, turning my back on him completely. The jazz band had ceased playing, leaving the microphone on a sleek chrome stand in the center of the room. I walked past the bewildered musicians and gripped the cold metal shaft of the microphone. I tapped it twice. The sharp, amplified thud echoed through the sprawling mansion, demanding absolute attention. The remaining murmurs in the room died instantly. "I'd like to thank you all for coming to my home tonight to celebrate." I began, my voice booming across the grand foyer. My words carried a deadly, controlled resonance. "However, before you enjoy any more of this expensive champagne, there is a fundamental truth regarding the recent Caldwell family history that needs to be officially clarified for the public record." Monica's face went completely ashen. She took a hesitant step backward, colliding with a towering floral arrangement. Mitchell Pierce stepped smoothly into the center of the room, from his position by the double doors. He opened his red legal binder, not with the intent of reading from it, but to distribute its contents. He began handing thick, stapled packets of paper directly to the closest venture capitalists and socialites in the front rows. "What my attorney is handing you," I continued, my gaze sweeping over the horrified crowd, "is a certified, unsealed copy of an emergency room toxicity report from Oak Brook Memorial Hospital. It is dated November 12th, 2 years ago, the exact night my daughter-in-law suffered her tragic miscarriage." Bradley lunged toward the microphone stand, his face contorted in sheer panic. "Stop it!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "You are insane! Security, remove him!" The private security detail remained frozen by the doors, unwilling to violate a federal injunction to remove the legal owner of the property. I easily sidestepped Bradley's clumsy grab, maintaining my grip on the microphone. The first guests to receive the packets began scanning the clinical data. Gasps erupted as their eyes caught the highlighted sections. "If you turn to page 3, I instructed, my voice cutting through Bradley's frantic shouting, "you will see the conclusive blood panel results. You will note that Monica Caldwell's blood contained nearly lethal concentrations of cocaine and amphetamines at the exact moment she arrived at the hospital." Monica let out a strangled, breathless cry, her hands flying to cover her face. The room erupted into a cacophony of shocked whispers. Several prominent investors actively recoiled from her, their expressions twisting from polite confusion into visible disgust. The meticulously crafted narrative she had sold them. The tragic story of the grieving victimized mother was disintegrating in real time. She was not pushed down the stairs by a raging father-in-law. I declared the absolute finality of my words, striking the room like a physical blow. She fell because she was severely intoxicated on illicit narcotics, violating the strict morality clause of her grandfather's trust fund. The entire assault was a fabricated, calculated perjury designed exclusively to protect a $7 million inheritance and to steal my company. Bradley grabbed my arm, his fingernails digging into the fabric of my suit, tears of pure desperation welling in his eyes. "Dad, please, you are destroying everything," he sobbed, his voice devoid of any remaining dignity. I wrenched my arm free with a violent jerk. "I did not destroy anything." "Bradley," and I retorted, my voice amplified perfectly for the entire room to hear. "You destroyed this family the moment you raised your right hand in a court of law and swore to a lie that sent your innocent father to a maximum security prison." Monica's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, the heavy fabric of her designer gown pooling around her. She hyperventilated, clutching her chest, as she realized the catastrophic scope of her exposure. The high society peers she had so desperately tried to impress were now staring down at her with undisguised contempt. The elite social circle she had built her entire identity around was permanently, irreparably fractured. The truth was out, and her reputation was utterly annihilated. Bradley snapped out of his paralyzed state, his shock instantly morphing into unhinged, explosive rage. He lunged across the polished hardwood floor, his face flushing a deep mottled crimson as adrenaline hit his system. Stopping mere inches from my face, he began screaming at the top of his lungs, abandoning any facade of high society etiquette. His voice cracked violently as he hurled insults, aggressively branding me a delusional, insane old man who had lost his grip on reality. He whipped his head toward the heavy oak double doors, his frantic eyes locking onto the security contractors, still lingering near the entryway. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest, issuing a desperate command to the hired muscle. He ordered the armed men to physically drag me out of the mansion, immediately repeatedly bellowing that this was his personal property, his sanctuary, and his absolute domain, where I held zero authority. The head of the security detail shifted his weight uncomfortably, resting his hand near his radio, yet he did not take a single step forward. The contractor glanced nervously at Mitchell Pierce, clearly remembering the federal injunction presented just moments earlier at the main gate. The palpable hesitation from the hired security caused the tension in the grand foyer to spike exponentially, leaving Bradley standing completely exposed and entirely unsupported by his own heavily armed guards. I did not flinch, nor did I retreat a single inch from his aggressive, threatening posture. Maintaining unbroken, deadly eye contact with my frantic son, I reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit. My fingers brushed against a crisp, heavy parchment carefully folded and waiting silently for this exact catastrophic second to arrive. I withdrew the document, unfolding it, so the overhead crystal chandeliers illuminated the embossed gold seal of the county recorder office. I lowered my voice to a sharp, penetrating register, delivering the devastating truth directly into his flushed face. "You never owned a single square foot of this estate, Bradley," I stated coldly, watching his pupils dilate as the words finally registered in his brain. He let out a breathless, desperate scoff, shaking his head in violent denial. He frantically argued that his name was engraved on the brass mailbox, that he personally paid the monthly landscaping fees, and that he exclusively possessed the primary security codes to the front gates. He rattled off these trivial domestic responsibilities in a panicked rush, acting as if they somehow miraculously equated to legal sovereignty over a multi-million-dollar property. I cut off his pathetic rationalizations, projecting my voice, so the surrounding guests could hear every syllable with absolute clarity. Paying a utility bill does not miraculously grant you a property title, I informed him, snapping the heavy document open for everyone to see. I read the exact legal phrasing aloud, confirming that Harrison Caldwell remained the sole, undisputed, and exclusive title holder of the $2,800,000 mansion. Mitchell stepped out from the periphery, smoothly transitioning from a passive legal observer to an active, lethal executioner in this unfolding drama. He reached into his red leather binder, his movements calm, practiced, and deliberate. He produced a brightly colored neon pink document, its vibrant hue standing out aggressively against the muted elegance of the surrounding high society gala. Closing the short distance between himself and my son, Mitchell did not offer the paperwork politely or wait for acknowledgement. With a swift motion, my attorney slapped the neon pink paper flat against Bradley's custom tuxedo shirt. The sharp smack of the paper hitting the starched fabric echoed loudly through the silent room, forcing Bradley to instinctively grab the document before it fluttered uselessly to the floor. "That is an emergency court-approved notice to quit," I explained, dictating the severe, non-negotiable parameters of his brand-new reality. As of 8 o'clock this morning, any implied tenant at will agreement you mistakenly believed you held has been formally and irrevocably terminated by a presiding county judge. Your lease is officially canceled. Monica, still crumpled on the floor amidst the ruined fabric of her designer gown, let out a pathetic, keening whimper. She crawled a few desperate inches toward Bradley's legs, her face staring up at the neon pink paper in his trembling hands. Her panicked, racing brain visibly struggled to process the sudden catastrophic loss of her ultimate status symbol and her primary source of social leverage. I looked down at the two of them, delivering the final parameter of their immediate eviction. "You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate these premises," I declared, raising my wrist to check the time on my platinum watch. "You have 10 minutes to gather whatever personal items fit into your pockets before you are both considered to be criminally trespassing on my private land." Blind panic consumed Bradley as the reality of the ticking clock finally set in. He spun around wildly, looking desperately at the surrounding circle of venture capitalists, corporate investors, and elite socialites. He begged the affluent crowd for help, pleading for someone to intervene, to call a defense lawyer, or to at least offer them a safe place to stay for the upcoming night. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and devastating. The wealthy guests actively stepped backward in perfect unison, forming an even wider, insurmountable circle of total isolation around the disgraced couple. The elites realized they were witnessing a financial and social execution, and self-preservation dictated that they abandon the sinking ship immediately, refusing to offer a single shred of assistance to a sinking man, to solidify the absolute finality of my command. The heavy oak front doors swung open wider. A pair of uniformed sheriff deputies previously stationed at the perimeter by Mitchell to enforce the judicial mandate stepped confidently into the grand foyer. Their hands rested easily on their black duty belts as they locked eyes directly with Bradley. The ultimate countdown had officially begun, sealing their miserable fate. Monica staggered to her feet, her hands clutching the shredded remnants of her designer gown. Her face, previously a mask of aristocratic superiority, was now contorted in sheer, unadulterated panic. She shoved past a group of terrified investors, her manicured fingers fumbling frantically with her diamond-encrusted smartphone. "I'm calling the police!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the immense strain. "I'm having you arrested for trespassing, for assault, for everything." I did not step forward to stop her. I did not raise my voice to drown out her hysterical threats. I simply stood in the center of the grand foyer, surrounded by the shattered remains of their high society facade. I offered her a warm, almost paternal smile, the kind of smile one reserves for a child who has just made a terribly foolish mistake. "Save your battery, Monica," I said, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying calm. "They are already outside." As if on cue, the world outside the massive bay windows erupted in a chaotic symphony of violence. The deafening wail of federal sirens pierced the night air, shattering the final illusion of their perfect stolen life. Brilliant flashes of red and blue strobe lights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the rain-slicked cobblestone driveway in a blinding, aggressive display of absolute authority. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots slamming against pavement echoed menacingly toward the front entrance. The heavy oak double doors did not simply open. They were violently breached. A tactical team, clad in heavy Kevlar vests and tactical helmets, swarmed into the grand foyer. Bold yellow lettering across their chests clearly identified them as agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The absolute silence that had enveloped the room moments earlier was instantly replaced by the terrifying, deafening roar of coordinated federal action. "Federal agents, nobody move hands where we can see them," the lead agent roared, his voice echoing off the marble floors. He swept his sidearm across the room, securing the perimeter with chilling efficiency. A secondary team, clad in dark windbreakers, bearing the insignia of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, poured into the room immediately behind them, their faces set in grim, unrelenting focus. The 200 elite guests, the venture capitalists, corporate investors, and socialites, who had come to celebrate the Caldwell dynasty, instantly scattered in absolute terror. High heels clattered against the marble floor as women shrieked, dropping their expensive champagne flutes. Men in custom tuxedos scrambled backward, raising their hands in desperate surrender, their faces pale with the sudden, horrifying realization that their prestigious social gathering was now an active federal crime scene. Bradley remained frozen in place, his face drained of all color. He stared at the heavily armed, his mind unable to process the catastrophic reality unfolding before his eyes. He slowly raised his hands, his fingers trembling violently. "This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper against the deafening chaos. "This is a huge mistake. We haven't done anything wrong." Agent Elias Thorne, the veteran investigator I had met in the subterranean garage, stepped through the breached doorway. He did not look at the terrified guests or the scattering socialites. He walked directly toward Bradley, his expression carved from solid granite. He pulled a thick sheaf of documents from his tactical vest, the very same encrypted files Mitchell Pierce had smuggled out of my prison cell. "Bradley Caldwell," Agent Thorne announced, his voice slicing through the noise with chilling precision. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, international money laundering, and aggravated perjury. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Two agents immediately flank Bradley, unceremoniously grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing in the silent room was a sound I had dreamed of for 2 excruciating years. Bradley did not resist. He simply stared blankly at the floor, his entire world collapsing around him in a spectacular, irreversible implosion. Monica, still clutching the ruined fabric of her gown, let out a piercing, hysterical scream. "No, you can't do this! I am a victim! He pushed me! Harrison pushed me!" she wailed, pointing a frantic finger in my direction. Agent Thorne turned his attention to her, his gaze utterly devoid of sympathy. "Monica Harper Caldwell," he stated, his voice a cold, unyielding hammer. "We have the toxicology reports. We have the offshore routing numbers. We have the digital footprint connecting you directly to the Cayman Island shell accounts. You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated perjury, and obstruction of justice." A female agent stepped forward, firmly gripping Monica's wrists and forcing them behind her back. Monica thrashed wildly, her manicured nails clawing uselessly against the agent's tactical vest. "You are making a mistake! I am the victim here!" she screamed, her voice cracking as the steel cuffs snapped shut around her wrists. I watched the scene unfold with a terrifying, absolute clarity. The frantic, desperate woman sobbing on the marble floor was the exact same woman who had poured industrial adhesive onto a dying woman's medical cushion. The man being dragged toward the exit was the exact same man who had stood before a judge and sworn to a lie that sent his innocent father to a maximum security prison. They had stolen my company. They had stolen my freedom. They had stolen the last peaceful days I could have shared with Patricia. But they had failed to realize one crucial, fatal detail. I was not a helpless, clueless old man. I was the architect of their absolute, irreversible destruction. And I had orchestrated this spectacular, devastating downfall with the clinical, merciless precision of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Agent Thorne signaled with a sharp tilt of his head, and the extraction team moved in with practiced military precision. The lead agent recited the litany of federal charges: wire fraud, tax, evasion, perjury, and embezzlement, each word striking the opulent foyer like a physical blow. The metallic click of the handcuffs securing Monica's wrists resonated through the silent room, a sharp, cold sound that echoed the precise cruelty of her past actions. Those were the exact same manicured hands that had callously squeezed industrial adhesive onto my dying wife's medical cushion. Now they were locked behind her back, stripped of their power and privilege. She sagged against the agent holding her, her knees buckling, as the sheer weight of her impending reality crashed down upon her. The designer gown she wore, a symbol of her stolen status, now looked absurdly out of place against the stark reality of federal custody. Bradley's reaction was entirely different. The arrogant facade he had maintained for years completely shattered. He did not attempt to negotiate or offer a fabricated excuse. Instead, he dropped heavily to his knees, his expensive tuxedo pants tearing against the marble floor. The sudden loss of altitude seemed to physically diminish him. He looked up at me, his face contorted in a mask of absolute unadulterated terror. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat on his forehead. "Dad, please!" He sobbed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail that barely resembled my son. "I'm your son, I'm your blood. You can't let them do this to me." His desperate plea hung in the air, a pathetic attempt to leverage a biological connection he had long since discarded. The surrounding agents paused for a fraction of a second, anticipating my reaction. I did not move. I did not flinch. I looked down at the man kneeling before me, observing the frantic, pleading eyes that had once sworn under oath to a fabricated crime. The contrast was staggering. This was the same man who had confidently orchestrated a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme, who had eagerly planned to have me declared mentally incompetent, and who had watched me go to prison with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. Now, reduced to a sobbing wreck on the floor of a house he never truly owned, he was attempting to cash in a moral blank check he had long since bankrupted. Agent Thorne stepped closer, his demeanor impassive. He reached into his vest and produced a secondary document, a federal asset seizure warrant. He unfolded it deliberately, presenting it to Bradley with a cold, calculated efficiency. In addition to the criminal charges, Thorne stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy, the federal government is formally seizing all offshore accounts linked to SDA Holdings, the luxury yacht currently docked at Belmont Harbor, and the entire contents of your personal investment portfolios. Every single asset acquired with laundered funds is now property of the United States government. The revelation struck Bradley with the force of a physical blow. The realization that he was not only facing decades in prison, but was also instantly, irrevocably bankrupt, sent him into a renewed frenzy of sobbing. He lunged forward, attempting to grab the hem of my tailored trousers. An agent instantly intercepted him, forcing him back down with a firm hand on his shoulder. "Don't touch him," the agent warned, his tone sharp and commanding. Monica, witnessing the complete evaporation of her stolen wealth, let out a strangled, breathless cry. The $7 million trust fund she had desperately tried to protect with her vicious perjury was now permanently out of reach. The federal seizure warrant effectively froze all her assets, including the trust, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Her meticulously constructed empire of lies had collapsed, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the impending reality of a federal prison sentence. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and profound, paralyzing fear. The elite guests, previously frozen in shock, began to slowly edge toward the exits. their self-preservation instincts overriding any lingering sense of social obligation. The venture capitalists and corporate investors who had previously fawned over Bradley now looked at him with undisguised contempt. The high society gala had transformed into a public execution, and nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire. Mitchell Pierce stepped forward, directing the flow of the retreating guests, ensuring that the federal agents had clear, unobstructed access to their targets. Bradley's sobbing intensified as the agents began to haul him to his feet. He thrashed weakly against their grip, his desperation escalating as the reality of his situation set in. "You planned this," he screamed, his voice raw and ragged. "You planned all of this from the beginning. You set me up." His accusation echoed through the grand foyer, a final pathetic attempt to deflect responsibility. I remained silent, observing his frantic struggle with a cold, detached clarity. I had not set him up. I had merely provided him with the opportunity to hang himself, and he had eagerly taken the rope. The intricate trap I had laid from my prison cell had functioned flawlessly, but the mechanism was entirely powered by his own greed, his own arrogance, and his absolute lack of a moral compass. He was the architect of his own destruction. I was merely the executioner. Agent Thorne signaled the extraction team, and they began to move Bradley and Monica toward the heavy oak double doors. The blinding red and blue strobe lights from the squad cars outside cast erratic, disjointed shadows across their terrified faces. As they were dragged past me, the deafening roar of the sirens seemed to amplify the absolute finality of their defeat. The empire they had stolen was gone. Their freedom was gone. Their reputations were permanently annihilated. The reckoning I had meticulously planned had arrived, and it was absolute, merciless, and completely irreversible. Agent Thorne gestures sharply, and the tactical perimeter tightens, isolating the prisoners from the few straggling caterers huddled in the kitchen hallway. The rhythmic crunch of heavy boots stomping across the imported rugs signals the arrival of the Federal Evidence Collection Team. They march in carrying stacks of flattened cardboard boxes, ready to strip the mansion of every hard drive, printed ledger, and piece of physical correspondence hidden inside the home. Forced onto his knees, Bradley violently twists his shoulders against the thick restraints, causing the reinforced steel chain of the handcuffs to bite deeply into his own bare wrists. A sharp rip echoes as the seam of his custom tuxedo jacket splits open down the back, exposing the sweat-drenched fabric of his dress shirt underneath. I step deliberately into his immediate line of sight, letting my shadow fall heavily over his trembling, defeated frame. I gaze down at the man who used to be my son, feeling a terrifying, absolute void where paternal affection once resided. There is no urge to scream, nor is there a single tear welling in my eyes. My heart beats with a slow, mechanical rhythm contrasting sharply against his own shallow hyperventilation. His panic rapidly borders on a full-blown medical episode right there on the cold marble floor. Desperation strips away his last shred of loyalty as he attempts to negotiate a frantic impromptu immunity deal right on the spot. He wildly offers to flip on everyone, promising Agent Thorne that he will provide the encrypted passwords to the hidden offshore accounts and testify against the organized crime syndicate. He eagerly attempts to trade his own new wife for a reduced sentence, sacrificing his marriage in a pathetic bid for self-preservation. Hearing this treacherous offer from across the expansive foyer, Monica unleashes a guttural string of profanities, thrashing violently against the two female agents securing her arms. She screeches that Bradley was the primary architect of the entire embezzlement scheme, loudly offering to lead the federal investigators to a hidden wall safe in the master bedroom containing his private ledgers. The united front they had maintained for years instantaneously shatters, replaced by a vicious, venomous race to see who can throw the other under the bus first. I completely ignore her hysterical outburst, keeping my attention locked solely on the pathetic, groveling man, sobbing uncontrollably at my very own feet. The foyer acoustic somehow deadens as I finally speak, my voice dropping to a deadly, perfectly level quiet that cuts through the surrounding chaos. My blood died in a hospital bed while I sat in a prison cell for a crime you committed. I state the absolute finality of the judgment sealing his fate permanently. He stops thrashing instantly, the last flickering ember of hope extinguishing completely behind his eyes as the realization of his total abandonment sinks in. "You are nothing to me but a thief." I continue letting the heavy words hang in the freezing air between us. "Have a nice life, Bradley." I pivot on my heel, turning my back on him, with a fluid, dismissive motion. The federal agents immediately part like the sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path for me toward the exit. Mitchell Pierce matches my stride, reaching into his pocket to hand me a heavy ring of brass keys. They are the newly recovered master set to the entire estate surrendered by the disgraced security detail just moments prior. Pushing through the shattered remnants of the front doors, I step out onto the expansive portico. A sudden biting November rain has just begun to fall, washing the tire marks and debris from the cobblestone driveway. A fleet of heavily armored transport vans now idles aggressively behind the initial row of squad cars, their massive engines rumbling with a deep, menacing vibration that shakes the very foundation of the luxury property. The extraction team shoves Monica into the rear compartment of a black tactical vehicle, ignoring her frantic kicks against the reinforced doorframe. Before slamming the door shut, a senior investigator reads her a secondary, specialized warrant, authorizing the immediate freezing of her late grandfather and his $7 million trust, ensuring she cannot hire private defense counsel. Her shrieks are abruptly silenced by the thick, bulletproof glass locking her inside. Agents march Bradley down the front steps, a moment later, loading him into a completely separate, windowless transport van to ensure the two co-conspirators cannot coordinate their alibis. He presses his bruised face against the heavy wire mesh of the small rear window, straining his neck to catch one final desperate glimpse of me standing freely on the porch. I do not offer him a parting glance or a nod of recognition. Mitchell checks his glowing smartphone screen, shielding the delicate device from the driving rain with his overcoat. He informs me that the corporate board of directors has already convened an emergency midnight session via secure conference call. They have formally drafted a unanimous resolution to reinstate me as the active chief executive officer, by dawn completely expunging the unauthorized executive directives from the corporate charter and the entire company history. The federal motorcade begins to roll out of the driveway, the synchronized convoy of flashing red and blue lights, fading quickly down the winding suburban street. The deafening wail of the sirens slowly dissipates into the distance, leaving behind a sudden profound and absolute quiet that settles heavily over the dark neighborhood. The storm clouds break slightly, allowing a faint trace of moonlight to pierce through the heavy, oppressive, overcast sky. I turn to face the massive, empty mansion, pulling out my phone to dial a specialized property management firm. I issue a strict order to send a boarding crew to seal every window and door by morning. The property will not be cleaned or restored. It will be listed for immediate demolition, wiping the final physical footprint of their betrayal from the face of the entire earth permanently. The ensuing federal trial was astonishingly brief, devoid of the theatrical courtroom drama my former daughter-in-law had so desperately craved. Faced with the insurmountable mountain of digital forensics, offshore routing documentation, and the damning audio recordings Mitchell Pierce had covertly obtained, the defense attorneys recognized the absolute futility of their position. They advised their clients to surrender completely, abandoning any hope of a protracted legal battle. Bradley, standing before the federal judge with his head bowed and his spirit entirely broken, formally entered a plea of guilty to all counts of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and perjury. The judge, an imposing woman with zero tolerance for high society criminals, delivered a scathing reprimand before sentencing my son to 8 years in a medium-security federal penitentiary, ensuring he would serve a minimum of 85% of his time before any possibility of parole. Monica's sentencing hearing occurred exactly 2 days later in the very same austere courtroom, and the outcome was significantly more severe. The prosecution successfully argued that her illicit narcotics consumption not only led to the tragic miscarriage, but also fueled the entire criminal conspiracy to frame me for aggravated battery. The unsealed emergency room toxicology report, coupled with her blatant perjury regarding the staircase incident, elevated her charges exponentially. The judge sentenced Monica to 12 years in a high-security federal women's prison facility, explicitly denying any requests for leniency or early release based on her previously fabricated victim status. The immediate aftermath of their convictions triggered a massive, highly publicized legal restructuring of the entire Caldwell estate. Mitchell worked tirelessly alongside a specialized team of probate attorneys to permanently and irrevocably sever all financial ties linking me to my disgraced son. We established a complex network of blind trusts, effectively ensuring that neither Bradley nor Monica would ever inherit a single penny of my accumulated wealth, even after their eventual release from the federal prison system. I officially designated a coalition of recognized philanthropic charities as my primary beneficiaries, solidifying the permanent exclusion of my immediate bloodline from my financial legacy. Simultaneously, the Federal Bureau of Investigation formally concluded their comprehensive asset forfeiture protocols. The luxury yacht Bradley had purchased using laundered corporate funds was auctioned by the United States Marshals Service, with the entire proceeds funneled back into the general operating accounts of Caldwell Logistics as partial restitution. The Cayman Island shell accounts managed by Monica's sister were systematically frozen, drained, and permanently shut down by international banking authorities collaborating with the Department of Homeland Security. Every trace of their stolen wealth evaporated into the complex machinery of federal asset recovery. I officially returned to the corporate headquarters of Caldwell Logistics on a crisp Monday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the sentencing hearings concluded. The transition was remarkably seamless. The board of directors, deeply relieved to have the founding visionary back at the helm, unanimously ratified my reinstatement as active chief executive officer during a special session. I immediately ordered a comprehensive top-to-bottom internal audit of every single department, ruthlessly excising the corrupt mid-level managers Bradley had installed to facilitate his fraudulent vendor contracts. The corporate culture underwent a rigorous immediate purification process, prioritizing absolute transparency and ethical compliance above all other operational metrics. To symbolize the permanent eradication of their toxic influence from my personal life, I listed the sprawling Oak Brook mansion on the open real estate market. I hired an aggressive high-end brokerage firm and explicitly instructed them to price the $2,800,000 estate for an immediate rapid sale. Within 48 hours, an international tech executive submitted an all-cash offer slightly above the asking price. I signed the transfer deeds without a flicker of hesitation, effectively erasing the physical location where my family had violently imploded. The property was gone, and with it the haunting memories of Monica's drug-fueled rages and Bradley's devastating betrayal. The rapid stabilization of my personal affairs allowed me to refocus entirely on aggressively expanding Caldwell Logistics. We launched a massive nationwide recruitment campaign, specifically targeting brilliant, hungry young executives who possessed unimpeachable ethical records. The infusion of fresh talent revitalized the company's operational efficiency, leading to the successful acquisition of 3 major international shipping contracts within the first fiscal quarter of my return. The logistics firm not only recovered from the financial hemorrhaging Bradley had caused, but actually began to exceed the revenue projections we had established prior to my wrongful incarceration. I relocated my primary residence to a sleek, highly secure penthouse apartment located in the heart of downtown Chicago, prioritizing minimalism and absolute privacy over sprawling, suburban opulence. The panoramic views of the city skyline offered a daily visual reminder of the vast empire I had successfully reclaimed from the brink of total annihilation. I furnished the new space with modern functional pieces, completely avoiding any items that might trigger unwanted nostalgia or sentimental attachment to the past. The penthouse became an impenetrable fortress of solitude, a physical manifestation of the impenetrable emotional boundaries I had finally learned to construct. During this period of intense corporate resurgence, I also finalized the establishment of a specialized legal defense initiative. Working closely with Mitchell Pierce, I allocated a substantial portion of my personal wealth to fund a dedicated team of aggressive defense attorneys who specialized exclusively in elder abuse cases. The initiative was designed to provide pro bono legal representation for senior citizens who found themselves falsely accused or financially exploited by manipulative family members. I transformed the darkest, most agonizing chapter of my life into a powerful, active resource for vulnerable individuals facing the exact same nightmare I had miraculously survived. The final wire transfer for the Oak Brook estate cleared the escrow account at precisely 9 o'clock on a brisk Tuesday morning. I sat at the glass desk in my downtown penthouse watching the 8-figure sum materialize on my encrypted monitor. I immediately initiated a secondary transfer, moving the entire massive payout directly into a specialized corporate charter I had finalized the night before. This massive infusion of capital served as the primary financial engine for the grand opening of the Patricia Caldwell Foundation. We secured a sprawling street-level commercial space located just 3 blocks away from the central municipal courthouse. The strategic location was selected specifically to provide immediate barrier-free access for senior citizens attempting to navigate the complex, terrifying labyrinth of the probate and guardianship dockets. I personally oversaw the rapid interior renovations, demanding warm, inviting mahogany textures and soft ambient lighting to replace the cold, intimidating atmosphere typical of traditional corporate law firms. We wanted our vulnerable clients to feel entirely safe the second they walked through our double-glass doors. By the second week of our active operations, Mitchell Pierce introduced me to our newly appointed executive director, a formidable woman named Sarah Jenkins. She possessed a terrifying, immaculate conviction rate from her previous tenure as a specialized prosecutor in the County Elder Exploitation Task Force. During our initial strategic briefing, Sarah presented our very first active case file. It involved an 80-year-old widow whose nephew had forged a durable power of attorney to quietly liquidate her retirement portfolio. I authorized unlimited legal resources for the widow, directing Sarah to absolutely crush the offending nephew with maximum civil and criminal penalties. The elderly widow sat directly across from my mahogany desk, her hands trembling as she described the sheer terror of losing her independence to a greedy relative. She wept quietly, tearfully, explaining how the police had initially dismissed her complaints as a simple domestic misunderstanding. I handed her a silk handkerchief, locking eyes with her, as I promised that our foundation would never allow her abuser to hide behind the facade of family. Within 48 hours, Sarah secured emergency injunctions, freezing the nephew's bank accounts, proving immediately that our elite legal strike force was brutally effective. The grateful smile that illuminated the widow's face provided a level of profound spiritual redemption that no corporate merger or expanding profit margin could ever possibly replicate. The profound satisfaction derived from deploying my wealth as a targeted weapon against familial predators provided a healing mechanism I never expected. My personal assistant entered my private office later that afternoon, carrying a small stack of incoming correspondence that had bypassed the digital filters. At the very bottom of the pile rested a standard prison-issued envelope bearing a distinct postmark from the medium-security federal facility housing my disgraced son. The handwritten return address listed his inmate identification number, a glaring, pathetic reminder of his catastrophic failure. I picked up the thin envelope, feeling the rough texture of the cheap paper against my fingertips. There was no surge of lingering paternal affection, nor did my pulse quicken with any morbid curiosity regarding his current suffering. I simply carried the sealed letter across the room and dropped it directly into a heavy-duty cross-cut office paper shredder. The machine roared to life violently, reducing his desperate, manipulative words into tiny, illegible strips of worthless confetti. I did not need to read his apologies or his excuses, because his voice had permanently lost all meaning and authority within my existence. Leaving the bustling foundation headquarters behind, I instructed my private driver to take me away from the busy downtown core. The luxury sedan glided smoothly onto the northbound expressway, carrying me toward the quiet, sprawling acreage of the Rose Hill Cemetery. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns and towering oak trees. I carried a massive, fragrant bouquet of fresh white lilies, holding the delicate flowers carefully as I navigated the smooth cobblestone pathways. The polished granite headstone marking Patricia's beautiful final resting place gleamed brightly under the warm, fading sunlight. I knelt slowly on the soft, manicured grass, placing the vibrant lilies directly against the cold, smooth stone. I took a deep, steadying breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, undisturbed autumn air. The crushing, suffocating weight that had relentlessly compressed my chest for the past 3 years finally completely evaporated. I spoke softly into the gentle breeze, updating my late wife on the magnificent weapon we had forged in her beautiful name. I detailed how her memory was actively shielding innocent people from experiencing the same terrifying vulnerability we had endured. The silence of the cemetery was not lonely or desolate. It was a profound, comforting stillness that wrapped around me like a protective blanket. The vicious, dark, turbulent storm that had violently uprooted my life was officially, permanently over. The sprawling empire was secure, the treacherous predators were locked away in concrete cages, and absolute undeniable justice had been completely flawlessly served. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to commit abuse, nor does it demand your infinite forgiveness. For years, I believed my absolute duty as a father was to absorb my son's mistakes, continually shielding him from harsh reality. But when family turns into a parasite that feeds on your destruction, cutting them off is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and respect. True family is built on integrity, gratitude, and mutual protection. If people sharing your last name willingly destroy your life to fund theirs, let them face the consequences alone. If this story opened your eyes, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another hard-hitting lesson. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Thank you for your amazing support today.